Today, we will journey into the era of the Inquisition, a time when fear was an invisible yet palpable resident of every home, and faith transformed into a tool for manipulation. Close your eyes and allow history to seize your imagination, but before you do, remember to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up, because by the end of my tale, you'll be fast asleep. Envision a world where a carelessly uttered word could attract the attention of individuals in long robes, their faces devoid of all empathy. We will unravel the mysteries of why people were condemned to a horrific death at the stake, what diabolical inventions were spawned in the minds of executioners, and why even innocent beauty could become a death sentence. This is a journey into a world where every glance, every whisper could cost you your life. We often picture the Inquisition as a scene with blazing bonfires, ominous dungeons, and hordes of fanatics whose eyes burn with an unholy fire. But behind this grim facade lay a meticulously crafted system, operating with a chilling calculation and the scope of a true theatrical production. The Inquisitors created a powerful machine that held entire cities in a state of constant tension and anxiety. One denunciation, one whisper, was enough to change someone's life forever. It all began with seemingly insignificant things: a suspicious look, laughter that was too loud, the aroma of food that seemed unfamiliar and foreign to the neighbors. An envious whisper became the first link in a chain of events that ended only in the flames. Kings and popes, like puppeteers, pulled the strings, and ordinary people became pawns in their cruel game for power, artfully disguised under the guise of holiness and piety. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. There are many more interesting videos ahead of you, and we'll continue on. To better understand the spirit of that time, let's consider one specific example. The Inquisitors came up with the so-called trial by water. A person was tied hand and foot and thrown into a body of water, most often a river, and then they watched what happened. If the test subject drowned, it was believed that his soul was pure, although life, of course, ended at the bottom of the river. If a person floated to the surface, he was immediately declared guilty of heresy, and the stake was already waiting for its new guest. It sounds like absurd black humor, but thousands of innocent people went through this monstrous ordeal. And this is just one of many examples of the cruelty and injustice of that era. But why did such a system arise? What made people resort to such barbaric methods? What secrets and mysteries does the Inquisition hide? In the next video, we will delve into the very heart of the Inquisition, into the shadowy places where it originated, into the world of heresy that instilled in the Church a fear surpassing any plague epidemic. We will walk through the dark workshops where the ropes of the rack creaked and the red-hot iron hissed, ready to burn flesh. We will learn how the Inquisition mercilessly broke human destinies, built powerful empires, and left a sinister mark on history that the Vatican might prefer to conceal forever. Are you ready to learn the truth, no matter how terrible it may be? People lived in an era when faith defined every aspect of their existence: what they ate, how they prayed, and even what they were allowed to think about. Any doubt in the dogmas of the Church was regarded as a direct threat to the existing order. Heretics were declared to be all who dared to think differently, from peasants who prayed to their own gods to scientists who tried to unravel the mysteries of the heavens and stars. Inquisitors saw them as a serious danger to the order that, in their opinion, held society together. They took to the task with incredible, truly frightening ingenuity. Wooden blocks designed for grinding bones and words extracted under torture broke not only bodies, but also lives. All this was done for one, as they believed, good purpose: to keep the world from collapsing under the weight of doubt and heretical thoughts. This is a story about people whose lives were ruined under the weight of false accusations, about women whose beauty became a cause for suspicion, and about scientists who paid the highest price for their innovative ideas. We will uncover stories that make you think about the tragic lessons of the past and show how this theater of fear influenced the development of the world. Echoes of those terrible events can still be found in the dusty archives of the Vatican. We will go behind the scenes of the Inquisition and see how the flames of those times illuminate our understanding of history. But before we continue, consider, how easily can fear and prejudice turn ordinary people into cruel executioners? Now we will embark on a journey into the past, to the origins of the Inquisition. This phenomenon was born in the dark shadow of the Middle Ages, when the Church faced an adversary that it feared most of all. And these were not witches flying on broomsticks and not diabolical Sabbaths, as often depicted in later legends. No, the main enemy of the Church was ideas that undermined its authority and power. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a wave of heresies spread across Europe. They arose in a variety of places, in remote villages and large cities, among simple peasants and educated artisans who gradually began to doubt what the Church proclaimed as truth. A special place among these heretical movements was occupied by the Cathars and Waldensians. These groups not only challenged the authority of priests, but also challenged the entire existing order. The Cathars mainly lived in the south of France, especially in the Languedoc region. They called themselves pure and believed in the existence of two opposing principles, good and evil. Good, in their opinion, was associated with the soul and the heavenly world, and evil with the body and the material world. They believed that the Church, with its gold, luxurious temples and lavish rituals, belonged to the world of evil. The Cathars rejected infant baptism, communion, and the very idea that priests were necessary for the salvation of the soul. They led a simple life, often refusing to eat meat and vowing to avoid wealth. Their leaders, who were called perfect, went around the villages and taught people to save their souls without the help of the Church. This made them extremely dangerous in the eyes of those in power. But why was the Church so afraid of the Cathars? What exactly in their teachings posed such a threat to it? The Waldensians appeared at the end of the 12th century in northern Italy. This movement was founded by a man named Waldo, a wealthy merchant who gave away his property to the poor and decided to live according to the gospel. The Waldensians also sought to simplify faith. They read the Bible in their native language rather than in Latin and preached without the permission of priests. They believed that every person has the right to speak about God, not just those who wear a church robe. Their ideas spread through the villages like wind and attracted those who were tired of constant church taxes. So we see that heresies did not arise out of nowhere. They were a reaction to the real problems and contradictions of that time. But how did the Church react to this challenge? And what consequences did this have for millions of people? The Church was well aware that if people began to study the sacred texts on their own, its monopoly on the truth, and therefore its power, would weaken significantly. This heresy not only caused fear among the clergy, but also posed a serious threat to the established social order. After all, kings and feudal lords, whose power was based on faith, understood perfectly well that if the people ceased to unconditionally obey the Church, who would then pay taxes and abide by established laws? The Cathars and Waldensians, although they did not call for open rebellion, were gradually destroying the usual world order with their ideas, creating alternative models of faith and society. And the Church decided to act decisively and immediately. In those distant times, the inquisitors did not yet sit in luxurious courts surrounded by parchments and books. They relied on brute force and intimidating spectacles to demonstrate to everyone deviation from the established rules is unacceptable and fraught with terrible consequences. Heretics were suppressed by brutal military campaigns and fire rather than protracted and complex legal proceedings. It was a real war with ideas that posed a serious threat to the existing order. Early inquisitors resorted to barbaric trials that were more like sinister rituals than honest attempts to establish the truth. One of the most common ways was the trial by red-hot iron. The accused was handed a piece of metal heated to red hot and forced to hold it in his hands. If the skin did not burn and the person endured unbearable pain without uttering a single moan, this was considered a sign of his innocence and purity. However, if burns remained on the skin or the person cried out in pain, this served as proof of his guilt, and the fate of the unfortunate was decided instantly and irrevocably. Another common trial was the trial by boiling water. The suspect was forced to put his hand into a cauldron filled with boiling water. Then they carefully watched how the resulting wounds healed. Rapid recovery was considered a divine blessing, while purulent inflammations and scars indicated a connection with dark forces. These methods were more like a symbolic judgment of God than a sincere attempt to establish the truth. The inquisitors sincerely believed that higher powers themselves would figure out who was right and who was wrong. But it is worth noting that such trials were not used everywhere. Much more often, heretics were simply grabbed without any proceedings and taken straight to the stake. Torture, in the modern sense of the word, was almost never used at that time. Everything was based on fear and intimidating spectacle. People saw how the merciless flame devoured the apostates, and this made them keep silent and hide their true beliefs. However, heresies continued to spread like weeds, capturing entire regions. The Cathars created their own communities where they practiced their faith, and local priests gradually lost their parishioners. The Waldensians also did not lag behind. They spread their books and sermons through villages and hamlets, attracting more and more followers. And then the church called on the secular authorities for help. Kings and barons eagerly responded to this call because the lands of the heretics could become a tasty prey for them. One of the first victims of the Inquisition forever entered history. Beatrice de Planisol, a resident of southern France, was a Cathar and refused to renounce her faith. She was seized, brought to the town square, and tied to a pole. A huge crowd gathered around, buzzing with curiosity and fear. The flame flared up, and her body disappeared in clouds of smoke. This terrible sight became a cruel lesson for all who watched the execution. The church made it clear that only one fate awaited apostates: death in torment. Such scenes were repeated more and more often. Heretics were burned for the slightest manifestation of disobedience and for any word that challenged the established order. These executions were part of a carefully designed plan. The inquisitors understood perfectly well that fear works much more effectively than any sermons. People saw the fire and involuntarily wondered, is it worth arguing with those in whose hands the torch is? But heresies didn't vanish. They merely went underground, hiding in the mountains and forests. The Cathars created a whole network of secret communities where their perfects continued to teach people to live without the church. The Waldensians also refused to surrender. Their sermons spread like the wind, and the church gradually lost control of the situation. Trials by ordeal, of course, could frighten the crowd, but they couldn't eradicate the roots of heresy. The church realized that it needed a new, more powerful force to break the heretics. And this became the first step toward creating what we now call the Inquisition. But why weren't a few bonfires enough? What pushed the church to create such a complex and cruel system for suppressing dissent? After a long and bloody war with the heretics, the church concluded that bonfires alone were not enough to completely eradicate heresy. In the 13th century, after the completion of the military campaigns against the Cathars, the victors decided to keep the survivors under strict control. Yellow crosses became part of their sinister plan. This innovation was adopted at the Council of Toulouse, where priests gathered to consolidate their victory. Repentant heretics were forced to wear 2 yellow crosses, one on the chest and one on the back. The crosses were large enough to be clearly visible in the crowd. The color yellow was chosen deliberately, as it attracted attention, and in those days was associated with shame and diseases, such as leprosy. People tried to avoid those who wore these ominous signs, which led to the complete isolation of the Cathars from society. Life with a yellow cross became a real ordeal. A person could be driven out of a shop, refused work, children threw stones at them, and neighbors whispered behind their backs. The church strictly ensured that the crosses remained in place. If someone dared to tear off or hide the cross, they faced a new, even more cruel punishment, up to burning at the stake. This stigma kept the Cathars in constant fear. They became a living lesson for anyone who even considered going against the faith. The idea proved so effective that it was later used in other places. Yellow signs became a harbinger of how power can humiliate and persecute people, turning them into targets for universal hatred and contempt. The church achieved its goal. Heretics either broke down or disappeared without a trace. But how far was the church willing to go in its struggle for power and control over people's minds? The story of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, clearly demonstrates how cruelly even the most powerful people were punished. He was accused of supporting heretics, as the Cathars felt completely safe in his lands in southern France. The church could not allow the count to protect those who undermined its influence. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III declared war on the Cathars, and Raymond came under attack. He was excommunicated from the church and threatened with the loss of his title and lands. The count ruled Toulouse, a rich and prosperous region where heretics lived openly. He didn't want war, but he didn't want to betray his subjects either. But what happened next to the Count of Toulouse? How did he get out of this difficult situation? And what lessons can be learned from this story about power, faith, and betrayal? Determined to break the Count's will and teach a clear lesson to anyone who dared to patronize dissenters, the church devised a cunning plan. Raymond, understanding that only repentance could preserve his power, agreed to a humiliating procedure. On a hot day, at the beginning of summer, he arrived in the town of Saint-Gilles. He was ordered to remove his shoes and luxurious clothes. Barefoot, dressed only in a simple shirt, he was forced to walk through the streets, subjected to public humiliation. Whips mercilessly lashed his back, leaving bloody welts. The crowd gathered along the road watched this spectacle with curiosity and gloating. People saw how the Count, who had ruled them for many years, fell under a hail of blows. Priests, walking nearby, recited prayers and ensured that the punishment was carried out to the end. Raymond, gritting his teeth, endured the pain, but each lash of the whip reminded him of the price he had to pay for his pride and insubordination. This was not just humiliation, but a carefully planned show designed to intimidate and subdue the crowd. The Count's path lay through dust and dirt. Sharp stones dug into his feet, and the scorching sun burned his head. People in the crowd were either silent or shouted insults. Some pitied the Count, others rejoiced at the fall of a strong and powerful man. The church achieved its goal. Raymond survived, but his power was undermined. His lands became coveted prey for enemies who were just waiting for the right moment to strike. But how long could Raymond maintain his power in this position? And who could take advantage of his weakness? In 1215, Dominic Guzman, a Spanish priest and preacher, founded an order that later became the basis of the Inquisition. This man was determined to fight heresy with the power of words and intellect. He saw how the Cathars and Waldensians were leading people away from the church, and he decided to bring them back with persuasive sermons. His order was called the Dominicans, or the Order of Preachers. Pope Gregory IX entrusted them with the search for apostates, and they enthusiastically took up this cause. This is how the Inquisition, as we know it today, was formed. The Church chose the Dominicans because they had deep knowledge of theology and could successfully oppose heretics in theological disputes. Their sharp minds and rich experience in preaching made them an ideal tool in the hands of the Church. But why was such an important and dangerous mission entrusted to the Dominicans? And how did they manage to create such an effective system for identifying and suppressing heresy? The Dominicans brought order and structure to what was previously chaos and anarchy. They developed strict rules that became their charter and created a complex machine that fished out heretics step by step. This machine relied on a system of denunciations. Anyone could become an informer. A neighbor noticed that someone was praying too quietly and reported it to the monks. A wife informed on her husband if he read strange books. Even children, not understanding the consequences of their words, could point to their parents, condemning them to terrible torment. The Dominicans collected these rumors and gossip as a spider weaves its web. They were in no hurry to grab every suspect. First, they carefully checked the information received, dug deeper, and looked for evidence. The denunciation became only the beginning, a thread that led to the suspect. The monks understood that heresy was hiding in thoughts, and they knew how to find it with the help of other people's eyes. But how to distinguish truth from lies? And how could an innocent person protect themselves from false accusations? Then the interrogations began. The suspect was summoned to a closed room. These were not noisy squares full of people, but quiet, gloomy halls where silence and shadows reigned. The Dominicans sat at the table, laid out feathers and books. They asked questions, listened carefully to the answers, and recorded every word. The person could be asked if they believed in the Holy Trinity or regularly attended Mass. Any confusion in the answers or silence was carefully recorded. The monks delved into the smallest details of the suspect's life, looking for missed services, strange habits, and rumors circulating about them. They believed that lies would necessarily betray themselves in words, and they extracted it with persistence and perseverance. The interrogations lasted for hours, and sometimes for days. A person remained alone with their ruthless minds until the truth, or what they thought was the truth, surfaced. But what if the person was innocent? How could they withstand this psychological pressure and prove their innocence? Torture was rarely used in those days. The monks relied more on the power of words and threats than on physical violence, although psychological pressure could break anyone. The courts completed this complex and multi-stage process. The Dominicans collected all the evidence obtained as a result of denunciations and interrogations. They convened meetings where they passed judgment. These were not quick executions at the stake, but long and thorough proceedings with records and rules. The monks read out the accusations, leafed through their books, and discussed the fate of the suspect. A person could be found guilty of heresy, blasphemy, or even for doubts that they held in their mind. The sentences were different. Some were released with a warning, others were sent into exile. But if the guilt seemed too serious, the case went further. The Dominicans handed over the condemned to the secular authorities, who lit the fire. The monks themselves rarely got their hands dirty in blood, leaving the execution to others. But who controlled the inquisitors themselves? And how could one avoid an unfair accusation? This sinister code of rules held everything together. Its foundations were laid by early rules, and later people like Bernard Gui made it even stricter and more specific. Bernard was the Inquisitor of Toulouse in the early 14th century and wrote a book that became a model for all monks. He described in detail how to conduct interrogations, analyze denunciations, and pass sentences. His work became a kind of guide for inquisitors, helping them to effectively combat heresy. But what happened when words and threats proved ineffective? And how did the Inquisition deal with those who refused to admit their guilt? The Inquisition did not always rely only on words. By the mid-13th century, the Church faced a new problem. Heretics were becoming increasingly cunning and inventive. They carefully concealed their thoughts, and interrogations without the use of force lost their sharpness. The transition to the use of torture devices occurred when Pope Innocent IV issued a decree in 1252 that untied the hands of the inquisitors. Before that, they threatened more than used physical violence, but now torture officially became part of the rules. This did not mean that every interrogation ended in bloodshed. The Church wanted to obtain confessions, not corpses. But how far were the inquisitors willing to go in their attempts to break the will of the suspects? Torture devices were crafted by skilled artisans working for secular courts. Blacksmiths and carpenters forged iron and worked wood, transforming them into mechanisms of pain. Inquisitors then took these inventions, added their own sinister ideas, and put them to use. This transition occurred out of dire necessity. When words and threats proved ineffective, the Inquisition resorted to torture. These horrific contraptions were designed to break not only the body, but also the spirit of the accused. But what exactly were these instruments, and what torments did the Inquisition's victims endure? One of the most infamous and brutal instruments of torture was the so-called Spanish boot. This was an iron device that tightly encased the leg from ankle to knee. Inquisitors would gradually tighten screws, compressing the leg until bones began to shatter and soft tissues turned into a bloody pulp. The victim would emit inhuman screams of agony, while the monks patiently waited for them to confess, believing that suffering would force the truth to surface. But how long could a person endure such torture before breaking? Another terrifying device was the wheel. The victim was tied to a large wooden circle, which was slowly rotated by the executioner. Ropes attached to the limbs gradually stretched the body, dislocating joints and damaging muscles. This agonizing stretching could last for hours, until the victim finally surrendered and confessed to all the sins attributed to them. But what if the person was innocent? And how long could they resist such unbearable pain? Yet another common instrument was the rack. The victim's hands were tied to ropes, and heavy weights were attached to their feet. The body was then hoisted into the air, suspended by the ropes. The mechanism slowly pulled the body upwards and downwards, stretching joints, tearing ligaments, and breaking bones. The pain became so excruciating that the person would lose consciousness and agree to anything just to end the torment. But did everyone survive such torture? And how many people died under torture, never admitting their guilt? However, these devices were not always put into use. More often than not, inquisitors used them merely to intimidate suspects. They would show the Spanish boot or rotate the wheel right before the victim's eyes. The sight of cold iron and the creaking of wood instilled a terror that was more potent than any physical pain. People had heard horrifying tales of those whose legs had been reduced to a shapeless mess, or those who had been stretched on the rack to the breaking point. Fear paralyzed the will and loosened the tongue, and many confessed to their sins without waiting for the screws of the Spanish boot to begin crushing their bones. The monks understood perfectly well that even the shadow of these sinister machines could make people talk faster than their sharp steel. They kept the torture devices in plain sight, as a constant reminder of what awaited those who showed stubbornness and disobedience. Pain came only when words lost their power, and words did not lose their power very often, because the fear of iron extracted the truth even from the most resilient. But what exactly could land someone in the clutches of the Inquisition's merciless machine? Heresy topped the list of crimes. Rejecting church dogma was considered the gravest sin. A person could question the Holy Trinity, the sacrament of communion, or the infallibility of the Pope's authority. Such seditious thoughts were extracted during interrogations, and they were enough to subject a person to torture. The Inquisitors saw heresy as a deadly poison that corrupted the souls of the faithful. Blasphemy was also punished severely. Any curse or sacrilegious utterance in church would reach the ears of the monks through numerous informants. If someone shouted curses at the altar or laughed during Mass, it became strong evidence of guilt. Even the slightest transgression could cost a person their life. Incorrect prayer also made it onto this sinister list. If a person whispered the words incorrectly or omitted certain parts, neighbors would notice these minor deviations and report them, and the inquisitors would decide that this was a sign of heresy. They sought any hint of deviation from the faith, any crack in a person's behavior. But how could they distinguish sincere doubts from intentional blasphemy? And didn't such suspicion lead to the persecution of innocent people? The monks dug very deep. Heresy was considered to be not only loud words, but also silence. If a person refused to answer questions during interrogation, it was interpreted as an admission of guilt. If they spoke too much, their words were carefully analyzed in search of lies and contradictions. Blasphemy could be found in a random curse uttered in a fit of anger, and an incorrect prayer could simply be an old habit that differed from the generally accepted canon. The Inquisitors saw a threat in every step, in every word, in every glance. They believed that a heretic infected others like a plague and burned them out without the slightest regret. The list of accusations was constantly growing. A person could be seized for a simple argument with a neighbor or for a quiet whisper in the corner. Anything that fell outside the boundaries of accepted norms became grounds for suspicion. Their machine ground down people for thoughts, words, and even for things they did not do. But did innocent people ever escape this terrible fate? However, if a person stubbornly denied their guilt and gave no cause for suspicion, they were sometimes released. It happened that the Inquisitors did not find enough evidence to issue a guilty verdict. In such cases, they could only issue a warning and leave the person alone, although such cases were extremely rare. The fear of false accusation still hung over everyone like a sword of Damocles. But why didn't a system based on fear and suspicion collapse under the weight of its own injustice? But here, a paradox arises. The Inquisitors meticulously recorded every cry of the victim. They kept detailed books in which they recorded absolutely everything: the groans under the Spanish boot, the cracking of bones on the rack, and the last words of the condemned before being burned at the stake. Their archives grew year after year, becoming thicker than the archives of kings. The monks recorded every interrogation, every trial, and every drop of pain. This made their records more accurate and complete than the chronicles of secular power. Kings often lost important documents during wars and fires, while the Inquisitors carefully guarded their sinister tomes. They recorded names, dates, and confessions. Every cry, every groan was written down on parchment, so that posterity would know how their machine worked. This was a matter of pride for them. They saw in it an order that overcomes the chaos of heresy. But why did they need such detailed documentation? And what goals did they pursue by recording every detail of their atrocities? Peter of Verona became one of the most prominent and controversial figures of the Inquisition. This Dominican monk lived in the mid-13th century and became famous for his ruthless struggle against heretics in northern Italy. He was born in Verona, into a family that itself leaned towards the heresy of the Cathars, but he chose the path of serving the Church. Peter distinguished himself with a sharp mind and an iron will. He was appointed inquisitor, and he zealously set about uprooting apostates from the faith. In the cities of Lombardy, he held trials, sought out heretics, and handed them over to the secular authorities for sentencing. He was feared and hated. People whispered that his gaze penetrated the very soul, and his words broke any resistance. Townspeople and artisans who rejected the Church saw him as a ruthless enemy. But why did he, raised in a family of heretics, become such a fierce fighter against dissent? In 1252, his life was tragically cut short. Peter was walking from Como to Milan when he was attacked. Townspeople who hated him for his cruel trials ambushed him on the road. One of them, a man named Carino, struck him on the head with an axe. The blow fractured his skull, and Peter fell to the ground. The attackers finished him off with a dagger, and his companion, another monk, was seriously wounded. The killers fled, but the news of Peter's death quickly spread throughout the area, and the Church did not remain silent. Peter was proclaimed a martyr for the faith. Just a year later, Pope Innocent IV canonized him, making him Saint Peter Martyr. He was revered as a defender of the faith, who gave his life for a just cause. But was his death an accident? And who was behind this brazen murder? The killers were, of course, found, but what awaited them? Carino, realizing the gravity of his actions, later repented of his crime and took monastic vows, trying to atone for his guilt. However, his accomplices who participated in the murder of the Inquisitor were captured, tried, and sentenced to a terrible execution on the wheel. Their bodies, mutilated and shattered, were put on public display to intimidate anyone who dared to raise a hand against the servants of the Church. With this cruel spectacle, the Church made it clear that even the death of an Inquisitor would not stop its hand and would not leave the crime unpunished. But how long did this struggle against dissent last, and what consequences did it lead to? Now we move to Spain, where the Inquisition took on its own special and unique form. Here, it grew out of the struggle for power and religious unity, becoming a powerful instrument in the hands of the crown. It all began in the late 15th century, when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united their lands, creating a unified Spanish kingdom. They dreamed of a strong and prosperous state, where everyone spoke one language and prayed to one God. To achieve this goal, they needed to eradicate any manifestations of dissent and strengthen the Catholic faith. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV gave them permission to create their own Inquisition, which differed significantly from the one operating in other European countries. The Spanish Inquisition became the tip of the spear, aimed against all who stood in the way of realizing their ambitious plans. By 1492, after the fall of Granada and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, it unfolded in full force, turning into a machine of terror and violence. But why exactly did Spain become the center of the Inquisition? And what factors contributed to its widespread adoption? The Spanish Inquisition kept a watchful eye on those who had converted to Christianity, but aroused the slightest doubt about the sincerity of their faith. These people, known as conversos, hailed from Jewish and Muslim families who had converted to Christianity under duress or of their own volition. The conversos were no accidental target. The Spanish Inquisition saw them as a serious threat to the purity of the Catholic faith. Jews who had converted to Christianity might secretly observe the Sabbath or prepare food without pork. Muslims sometimes whispered prayers in Arabic or fasted during Ramadan. These habits, retained from their past lives, did not go unnoticed. Neighbors, servants, and even children became informers, reporting the slightest suspicions to the inquisitors. The Church believed that such people were undermining the unity of Spanish society. They had been baptized, but their hearts, according to the monks, remained foreign and committed to the old faith. This phenomenon was called double faith. The inquisitors believed that double faith spread through society like a hidden poison, and they strived to eradicate it with all their might in order to create a unified and monolithic Christian kingdom. But how well-founded were these suspicions, and didn't they lead to the persecution of innocent people? Jewish conversos, also called marranos, were most often the victims of the Inquisition. After the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, many of them remained in the country after converting to Christianity. They held prominent positions in society, working as merchants, doctors, and scribes. Their intelligence and wealth aroused envy and resentment among the old Christians, who saw them as competitors. The old Christians spread rumors that the marranos secretly performed their rites, lit candles on Friday evenings, or read forbidden books. Evidence of their guilt was not always required. Rumors and unsubstantiated accusations were enough to start legal proceedings. But why were the Jews the object of such hatred? And how did their past affect their destiny? Muslim conversos, called moriscos, were also persecuted. They lived in villages and towns that had previously belonged to the Emirate of Granada. They were accused of performing ablutions before prayer or preparing food according to old Muslim customs. The inquisitors saw these actions as traces of Islam that did not fit into the new Christian faith. Suspicions of double faith arose from trifles. A person might accidentally turn away from an icon or miss Mass. A woman cooked meat without fat, and this became a clue. A man put on clean clothes on Saturday, and he was dragged in for questioning. The inquisitors delved into the smallest details of each person's life, gathering rumors, checking houses, and looking for traces of heresy. But how could one prove one's innocence when any action could be interpreted as treason? Neighbors became enemies, and one false denunciation could destroy an entire family. The church strived for purity of faith, and the conversos paid a heavy price for it. Baptism did not save them from suspicion, but on the contrary, placed them under the Inquisition's eternal crosshairs. The Spanish Inquisition differed from other European Inquisitions in that it served not only the church, but also the crown. Ferdinand and Isabella saw it as an effective way to unite the people and strengthen their power. But was religious purity the sole aim of the Inquisition? Conversos often held high positions in government, working as advisors, tax collectors, and merchants. Their wealth and influence aroused envy and temptation. Inquisitors confiscated their lands and money, replenishing the royal treasury. This made the hunt for double faith a very profitable business. But if the main motive was greed, then why did the Inquisition persecute poor conversos as well? Heresy, though less frequent, was also the object of persecution by the Spanish Inquisition. Inquisitors kept an eye on those who openly rejected church dogma or preached different religious teachings. Protestants, who appeared later, did not escape its attention. Lutheran ideas penetrated Spain through merchants and books, and the Inquisition ruthlessly burned them with fire. Alchemists and scientists who doubted church truths also fell into the nets of the Inquisition. But why did the conversos remain the main target? However, conversos remained the main prize of the Spanish Inquisition. They were suspected much more often than others because of their origins. Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity became scapegoats, blamed for all the troubles and misfortunes that befell Spain. Their faith was constantly scrutinized, and their destinies were broken in order to achieve religious unity. The church and the kings were building a new Spain where there was no room for doubt or dissent. But at what cost was this unity achieved, and how did it affect the development of Spanish society? The Spanish Inquisition resorted to special instruments of torture and execution, which turned its activities into a terrifying spectacle. One of the main instruments was the garrote. It was a simple but effective device consisting of a noose used for quick executions. The condemned person was seated on a wooden stool with a rope or iron collar around his neck. The executioner turned a screw at the back, tightening the loop. The neck broke with a characteristic sharp sound, and death occurred almost instantly. The garrote was valued for its neatness and humanity. It made it possible to finish the job without prolonged suffering, which created the impression of mercy on the part of the inquisitors. The garrote began to be used from 1480, when the Inquisition was just beginning to gain strength. This instrument of execution was chosen for those who repented of their sins before being burned at the stake. The garrote became a symbol of the Inquisition's power, which extinguished life without much noise or bloodshed. But can a quick death be called mercy when it is the result of an unfair trial and cruel persecution? Another notorious instrument of torture was the so-called Iron Maiden, although the reliability of its use by the Spanish Inquisition is doubted by historians. It was a tall cabinet, the inner surface of which was studded with sharp spikes. A person was led inside the cabinet, the door was closed, and the spikes pierced his body, causing unbearable pain. Historians argue about how often the Iron Maiden was used. The archives of the Spanish Inquisition do not contain any direct mention of this instrument, but the absence of mentions does not necessarily mean that it was not used. Why do historians doubt the use of the Iron Maiden? And what other sinister instruments of torture did the inquisitors use? Most likely, the Iron Maiden was in the basements of the Inquisition as a deterrent. It was shown to suspects in order to obtain a confession of guilt without the use of physical violence. Stories about a cabinet studded with spikes spread among the Spaniards and increased the fear of the Inquisition's court. Even if the Iron Maiden was rarely used in reality, its sinister image was forever imprinted in people's memory. The Inquisitors skillfully used these rumors as a powerful weapon that struck even the most steadfast and rebellious. By the 16th century, the Iron Maiden had turned into a real legend, although there is very little accurate documentary evidence of its existence. But why, then, is this image so firmly entrenched in people's minds? Public autos da fe raised the execution of heretics to a whole new level. The very name, which translates as act of faith, implied a religious justification for cruel reprisals. These ceremonies gathered thousands of spectators, attracting the attention not only of locals, but also of visitors from other cities and villages. Autos da fe began to be held from 1481 for the first time in Seville. On the appointed day, the condemned were led to the main square of the city. They were dressed in San Benitos, long shirts decorated with red crosses and images of tongues of flame, symbolizing their guilt. Inquisitors read out the sentences, priests offered prayers, and the crowd buzzed with curiosity and excitement. Then a huge bonfire was lit. Heretics were tied to poles, firewood was set on fire, and the relentless flame engulfed their bodies. Smoke rose high into the sky, and the cries and groans of the victims echoed over the square, instilling terror in the hearts of those present. Autos da fe lasted for hours. They began with sermons, continued with executions, and ended with religious hymns. It was a carefully staged spectacle designed to teach the people unquestioning obedience to the church and the crown. The Spaniards saw in the auto da fe the triumph of faith over apostates and the triumph of justice. The Inquisitors carefully planned every step of the ceremony. They chose large cities, such as Toledo or Valladolid, where it was possible to gather the largest number of spectators. The execution could take dozens of lives in one day. In 1485, 20 people were burned in one auto da fe in Zaragoza. People came to the square from early morning, took food and drinks with them, and stayed there until late at night, watching what was happening. This strengthened the power of the church and the crown, demonstrating their strength and might. People left the square with a firm belief that there was no place for heresy in Spain and that it would not survive under the watchful eye of believers. But how did autos da fe affect people's psyche? And didn't they generate even more fear and hatred? The garrote and autos da fe served different purposes. The garrote provided a relatively quick and humane death, while the autos da fe were public spectacles designed to intimidate and subjugate the people. The Iron Maiden, although it remains a subject of debate among historians, added a sinister shadow of horror that hovered over all those who came under suspicion. But how did the Inquisition determine who deserved death and who did not? Behind all these executions was the sinister idea of purity of blood. The Spaniards called it limpieza de sangre. It was a background check that determined a person's fate. Without pure blood, it was impossible to hold public office, join the clergy, or marry a member of the old Christian nobility. Purity of blood became a kind of racial criterion that determined a person's social status. But how did this idea arise? And what consequences did it have for Spanish society? It all began in 1449 in Toledo. Local authorities then forbade conversos from holding any positions in the city government. By 1547, this discriminatory law had spread throughout Spain. Now, every individual had to provide documentation proving they had no Jewish or Muslim ancestors. Inquisitors meticulously delved into the candidates' pasts, interrogated witnesses, and sought the slightest imperfections in their family trees. If a trace of Marranos or Moriscos was discovered, the path to success was forever closed. Even the grandchildren of converted Jews and Muslims lived under this burden, constantly fearing exposure. Purity of blood became a peculiar passport to life, determining a person's opportunities and prospects. It was checked upon entry into religious orders, such as the Dominicans, who originated from France but were also active in Spain. It was required for holding positions in courts and the treasury. Families guarded documents about their ancestors' origins like priceless treasures, as one false accusation could ruin everything. In 1556, a man in Seville was tried for providing fake documents of origin. He was stripped of his position in the treasury, and his family was branded as liars and deceivers. This rule divided Spanish society into two unequal parts. Old Christians prided themselves on their pure blood, while conversos were forced to hide their origins and live in constant fear of exposure. The Inquisition watched every step, maintaining a system of discrimination and inequality. It was building a new Spain where blood meant more than faith, talent, or personal qualities. But how long could such a system, based on lies and prejudice, endure? The Spanish Inquisition left an indelible mark on the lives of thousands, and its victims often became pawns in a cruel game of power and faith. One such unfortunate was Antonio del Campo, a merchant from Toledo, whose life tragically ended in 1561. He came from a converso family whose ancestors, Jewish by blood, had converted to Christianity to remain in Spain after the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews in 1492. Antonio led a modest life, trading fabrics and spices in the market, but his origin made him vulnerable to suspicion and accusations. In 1561, neighbors began spreading rumors about his strange habits. They noticed that he never bought pork from the butchers, and that on Saturdays he appeared at the market in fresh, clean clothes, which was considered suspicious. These trifles reached the inquisitors through an anonymous denunciation. One of the neighbors, whose shop was next to Antonio's, stated that Antonio avoided Christian food and did not live according to customs. The inquisitors immediately began an investigation. They burst into Antonio's house, overturned all the chests, and thoroughly inspected the kitchen. They found an oil lamp that was lit on Friday evening and a piece of cloth that they believed could be used for Sabbath rituals. Antonio insisted that he was a good Christian, regularly attended Mass, and revered the Holy Church. But his words were drowned out by a flood of accusations and lies. He was chained and taken to the dark dungeon of the Toledo tribunal. There, he was kept in dampness and cold and interrogated day and night. The inquisitors demanded that he confess to performing secret Jewish rites, but Antonio stood his ground. Then they resorted to cruel torture. Antonio was subjected to torture on the rack, and unable to withstand the unbearable pain, he broke and cried out something incoherent, which the inquisitors interpreted as an admission of guilt. The trial took place very quickly, and Antonio was accused of heresy, of allegedly secretly praying in Jewish fashion and rejecting Jesus Christ. The sentence was harsh and merciless. In 1561, Antonio del Campo was tied to a stake in the main square of Toledo. The firewood ignited, and the fire quickly engulfed his body. He burned alive before the eyes of the crowd, which watched the execution in a daze. His house and shop were confiscated, leaving his family without means of livelihood. The archives of the Toledo Tribunal have preserved this tragic case, clearly demonstrating how one false accusation could ruin the life of an innocent person. But what happened to Antonio's family? And how did this tragedy affect their future fate? Elvira del Campo, a relative of Antonio's, shared a similar fate in the same year. She was a merchant's wife, a mother of 4 children, and lived in the same city of Toledo. But what exactly happened to Elvira? And how is her story connected to the tragic fate of Antonio? Her name surfaced shortly after Antonio's execution, when the inquisitors decided to thoroughly cleanse the entire family to eradicate the slightest traces of heresy. A neighbor, who had long envied Elvira's wealth, denounced her, claiming that she cooked meat without pork and hummed strange melodies reminiscent of Jewish ones. He also claimed that he had heard her whispering at night when she stood by the hearth, praying to her pagan gods. The inquisitors immediately arrived at her home with a search warrant. They turned everything upside down, and in an old chest hidden under a pile of clothes, they found an old book in Hebrew inherited from her grandfather. Elvira swore that she knew nothing about this book and that she was a true Christian to the core. But her voice trembled with fear, and the court had already given her a guilty verdict. She was chained and taken to the same dark dungeon where Antonio had previously been held. The interrogations began with persuasion, but soon turned to threats and intimidation. Elvira held firm, but when the instruments of torture appeared before her, her will broke. She was tied to a table, her arms and legs stretched with ropes that tightened with each turn of the screw, causing unbearable pain. The inquisitors demanded that she name other heretics, but Elvira remained silent, unwilling to condemn other innocent people to torment. Then the inquisitors increased the pressure, tightening the screws tighter and tighter. Her body arched with tension, and finally she could not bear it and cried out a confession to something she had never committed. The trial convened in the same month. Elvira was accused of secretly following Jewish rites, singing forbidden songs, and denying the Christian faith. The verdict was foreordained. At the same auto da fe in 1561, she was led to the square in a San Benito with a cross on her chest, symbolizing her repentance. However, this cross did not save her from a cruel death. The bonfire blazed, and Elvira's screams drowned out the religious hymns sung by the priests. The crowd silently watched as another life dissolved into smoke, becoming a victim of religious fanaticism. Her case was recorded in the same grim archives of the Toledo Tribunal as Antonio's, as an example of a family chain of suspicion and persecution. But why did the Inquisition persecute entire families? And how was it possible to survive in a world where suspicion and denunciation had become commonplace? These tragic fates reveal the true essence of the Spanish Inquisition. Antonio and Elvira became victims of their origin. They were accused of crimes based on gossip, envy, and religious intolerance. The courts nitpicked over trifles to justify the cruel execution, and the truth was lost in the shadows of lies and hypocrisy. The fire of the auto da fe and anonymous denunciations fueled the universal fear that reigned in Spain, and the names of Antonio and Elvira remained in the documents of the Inquisition as a sinister warning to others. But how long could such a system, based on fear and violence, continue? The Inquisition repeatedly engaged in fierce battles with outstanding minds who sought to push the boundaries of human knowledge. Its dark shadow fell on those who boldly looked at the sky, studied the secrets of nature, and challenged church dogmas. Over the centuries of transition from the Dark Middle Ages to the era of great discoveries, disputes multiplied, in which science and faith crossed their swords in an irreconcilable struggle for the truth. One of the most famous and tragic episodes of this confrontation was the trial of Galileo Galilei. But he was far from the first whose innovative ideas caused concern in church circles. The Spanish and Roman Inquisitions vigilantly monitored the development of cosmology and alchemy, seeing in them a serious threat to the world order that had been built for centuries. These stories testify that the Inquisition punished people not so much for the knowledge they acquired, but for their courage and audacity. But why was the Church so afraid of science? And how did it try to stop the progress of human thought? The conflict between the Inquisition and Galileo flared up in Rome in 1633. Galileo was a prominent Italian scientist, famous for his observations of stars and planets. He convincingly proved that the Earth revolves around the Sun, relying on the revolutionary work of Nicholas Copernicus. The Polish astronomer Copernicus, who died in 1543, left behind a book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, which was published in the year of his death. Copernicus managed to avoid the Inquisition trial, as his work was published after his death, and during his lifetime, he tried to keep his innovative ideas to himself. The Church initially did not pay attention to this book, but later, in 1616, it was strictly banned. Galileo took Copernicus's ideas and went even further, making them public knowledge. But why did the Church react so strongly to Copernicus's ideas? And what exactly drew the Inquisition's attention to Galileo's work? Galileo's trouble began not because of his scientific discoveries, but because of his audacity and defiance of church authority. In that same year of 1616, Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, fearing the spread of heretical ideas, forbade Galileo from publicly defending the heliocentric system of the world, recognizing it as dangerous to the Holy Scripture. Galileo agreed to remain silent, but did not keep his word. In 1632, he published his Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican. This book, written in the form of a dialogue, compared Ptolemy's geocentric system with Copernicus's heliocentric system, presenting the latter in a more favorable light. This caused anger and outrage among the inquisitors, who saw this publication as a direct challenge to their power and authority. The trial of Galileo began in the spring of 1633. Galileo was summoned to Rome to testify. He was almost 70 years old, and his legs trembled with age, but he obeyed the order and appeared before the court. The Inquisition did not resort to physical violence. House arrest was chosen as the instrument of punishment, which, nevertheless, represented a serious restriction of freedom. Galileo was accused of violating the prohibition of 1616 and of spreading ideas that undermined the foundations of the Catholic faith. Galileo explained that his book only discussed various theories and did not impose them, but the judges remained deaf to his arguments. They forced him to recant heliocentrism and publicly admit, kneeling, that the Earth was stationary and at the center of the universe. The sentence turned out to be relatively lenient. Galileo was placed under house arrest in his home in Florence, where he lived until his death in 1642. His book was banned, but his ideas survived, spreading among scientists and thinkers. This case clearly showed that the Inquisition punished people not so much for scientific knowledge as for disobedience and challenging church authority. But what other scientific discoveries alarmed the Inquisitors? Cosmology, with its attempts to unravel the mysteries of the universe, posed a particular danger to the Church. Giordano Bruno's ideas about the infinity of the universe became a vivid example of this. Bruno, an Italian monk and philosopher who lived at the end of the 16th century, argued that stars are distant suns and the universe extends without end. His thoughts went further, denying the very existence of a center of the world and undermining established religious beliefs. The Inquisition seized him in 1593 in Venice, and his trial lasted for 7 long years. All this time, he was held in a dark cell, demanding renunciation of his beliefs. However, Bruno stubbornly insisted that his idea of the infinity of the universe did not contradict the existence of God in the slightest, but the Church stubbornly saw this as a serious threat to its authority. In 1600, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in the Campo dei Fiori Square in Rome. The flames became the last argument in his dispute with the Inquisition. The Inquisitors believed that such views undermined Holy Scripture and the established order. But why were they so afraid of these ideas? And how could a few scientific theories undermine the power of a mighty church? Alchemy, with its mysterious experiments and connection to magic, also aroused suspicion among the Inquisition. Alchemists were trying to find a way to turn base metals into gold or discover the secret of eternal life. Their laboratories were filled with smoke, the smell of sulfur, and complex symbols. The Inquisition suspected that dangerous knowledge and diabolical forces were hidden behind these experiments. And despite the fact that such cases arose less frequently in Spain, they still took place. In 1529, a man was tried in Toledo for practicing alchemy. He mixed various powders, read ancient manuscripts, and performed mysterious rituals. Neighbors reported him, claiming that he was brewing some potions and whispering spells. Inquisitors burst into his house and found drawings of circles, strange symbols, and writings in Latin. He was interrogated for a long time, accused of witchcraft and connections with dark forces. The court, however, decided to limit itself to expelling the alchemist from the city, avoiding burning at the stake. But why wasn't the Inquisition always so cruel to alchemists? And what frightened it more? The experiments themselves, or the possible consequences of conducting them. The Inquisition was sometimes surprisingly ambiguous in its attitude towards science. Some of its servants were themselves interested in scientific knowledge and even studied the stars. One such example was the Jesuit Christopher Clavius, who lived at the end of the 16th century. He was born in 1538 in Bamberg, Germany, and from a young age showed an interest in mathematics and astronomy. In 1556, he joined the Jesuit order, which combined deep faith with a thirst for knowledge. Clavius moved to Rome, where he taught mathematics at the Roman College, the order's main educational institution. He wrote books on geometry and astronomy, teaching young people and spreading scientific knowledge throughout Europe. His works were hugely popular and became a link between the old world and new scientific discoveries. But why were the Jesuits so actively involved in science? And what role did they play in the dissemination of knowledge in the era of the Inquisition? In 1579, Pope Gregory XIII invited Clavius to solve an important task. The Julian calendar, which had been used since the time of Julius Caesar, had by that time accumulated an error of 10 days. This led to a shift in the date of Easter, and the Church decided to correct this problem. Clavius enthusiastically undertook the solution of this complex task. He carefully collected data on the movement of the sun and moon, performed complex calculations, and developed a new system of chronology. His work took several years, but in 1582, the new Gregorian calendar saw the light of day. The Pope declared that October 15th would come immediately after the 4th, and 10 days were erased from history to restore the accuracy of the calendar. This calendar, developed by Clavius, is the one we use today. The Jesuits saw this achievement as a source of pride and proof of their intellectual power. The Inquisition preferred to remain silent, since the new calendar served its religious purposes. But how did Clavius manage to avoid suspicion of heresy? And why didn't his scientific achievements cause concern among the inquisitors? Another interesting story involves Francesco Ingoli, an inquisitor who maintained a lively correspondence with Galileo Galilei. Their intellectual dispute began in Rome at the beginning of the 17th century, when Galileo actively promoted the idea of the Earth's movement around the sun. Ingoli, a scientist and priest, was born in 1578 in Ravenna. He studied law and astronomy and later became a consultant to the Inquisition on scientific matters. In 1616, he wrote a letter to Galileo that marked the beginning of their long intellectual confrontation. Ingoli objected to heliocentrism, using not threats and repression, but logic and scientific arguments. He argued that the stars do not change their position, as they should if the Earth were really moving around the sun. This phenomenon, known as parallax, Ingoli considered unproven. He carefully studied Galileo's mathematical calculations, pointed out weaknesses in his reasoning, and offered his own calculations. Galileo responded to Ingoli with a detailed treatise in which he defended his calculations and refuted the opponent's arguments. The dispute between them stretched for years. But Ingoli was not a blind fanatic, obsessed with religious prejudice. He read Copernicus, studied the works of Tycho Brahe, and had a deep understanding of stellar physics. His letter to Galileo, written in 1616, went far beyond religious dogma. He reasoned about the laws of motion and how the sun and earth behave in celestial space. When Galileo appeared before the court of the Inquisition in 1633, Ingoli was no longer involved in the process. However, his arguments, formulated years before, still echoed in the courtroom. He died later, in 1649. The inquisitors used his words to corner Galileo and accuse him of violating the ban. This dispute showed that the Inquisition could enter the game of science if it saw a chance to strengthen its religious beliefs. Ingoli left his mark on the history of astronomy, even though he served those who persecuted the greatest scientists of his time. But how did the Inquisition treat women? And what crimes were they most often charged with? Women often found themselves in the shadow of the Inquisition's suspicions, their lives becoming threads in the complex web of its courts. The Inquisition saw women as a source of unrest and disorder that could destroy the foundations of faith and society. The accusations made against them went far beyond the myth of witchcraft, which later became so popular. They were judged for actions that seemed insignificant, but in the eyes of the Church contained an enormous. Elvira was one such victim when the Inquisitors decided to cleanse the entire family of heretical filth. A malicious neighbor, who had long coveted her property, reported that Elvira was preparing food without using pork lard, and also singing something in the evenings, possibly Jewish chants. When a book in Hebrew was found in her house, confessions were extracted through torture, and she was sent to the stake. A woman could be persecuted not only for her actions, but also because of her position in society. In 16th century Spain, widows and single old women often became victims of the Inquisition, as their independent lifestyle aroused suspicion. Neighbors slandered them, saying that they summoned spirits and cast spells. If a woman was found with needles, it was regarded as tools of witchcraft. They were subjected to interrogation and expelled from the city. This underscored how loneliness and vulnerability became a pretext for persecution. According to another slander, women were persecuted for their beauty. Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, in the treatise Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, claimed that the devil seduces through female appearance and that beauty is a trap that leads men away from God. In 1621, a woman was tried in Córdoba whose face and body supposedly possessed special charms and embarrassed her neighbors. The woman was interrogated, a mole was found on her back, calling it a sign of the devil, and burned. If a woman turned out to be too intelligent, it was also equated to heresy. In 1548, a widow from a Converso family was tried in Valencia for keeping the works of Erasmus of Rotterdam at home and discussing faith with guests. She was tried for putting reason above the church, sending her into exile and her books into the fire. For torturing women, the Inquisition throughout Europe used instruments such as the witch's chair, an iron throne studded with thorns that pierced the body. The woman was seated on it and tied with straps so that she could not move. The thorns pierced the skin, and every breath intensified the pain. Sometimes the chair was placed over a fire, heating the metal red hot. In 1611, a bread merchant named Maria was tied to such a chair in Germany for witchcraft. Her torment lasted a long time, but Maria never confessed to the witchcraft attributed to her. Another instrument of torture was drowning. A woman would be thrown into a river with her hands and feet bound. If she floated, this was considered proof of guilt, as the pure element of water did not accept diabolical power. However, if the woman drowned, no one recognized her as guilty of heresy, but this did nothing to save the accused. In 1588 in France, Jeanne, a basket weaver, was accused of drowning. Neighbors had falsely claimed that she had cast a spell on the harvest. After her drowning, she was found not guilty, but that did nothing to bring Jeanne back from the dead. In England, in 1609, Anne Whittle, known as Old Chattox, was convicted. She was an old woman who lived in a shack and dried herbs for her neighbors. She was undone by the envy of those who saw her as a witch. Under torture, Anne gave false testimony and was sentenced to be hanged. In the 18th century, the Inquisition ceased to exist. Enlightenment and humanism enabled people to realize that the world was not structured as the Church claimed. Science and technology gave impetus to the development of world civilization, and the fires of the Inquisition remained forever in the dark past. It was not a smooth sunset, but a fierce struggle of those who dared to challenge its all-powerful authority, from philosophers armed with a sharp pen to rulers with a firm will. The Inquisition, which for centuries had held the continent in fear and obedience, gradually retreated, leaving behind only a vague echo of former tribunals and the dark shadows of torture chambers. The 18th century brought with it a breath of fresh air and change, and the Inquisition began to rapidly lose its grip, giving way to new ideas and principles. But who were these daredevils who dared to confront the all-powerful Inquisition? And how did they manage to break its power? In Spain, King Charles III, who ruled from the mid-18th century, was inspired by the progressive ideas of the French Enlightenment thinkers. He happily read Voltaire, dreamed of transformations, and regarded the Inquisition tribunals as an outdated and unnecessary burden. He gradually limited their power, depriving them of their former influence and might. Public executions practically ceased, and interrogations turned into an empty formality, devoid of any meaning. But why did Charles III decide to go against the Inquisition? And what motives drove him? In Portugal, the Marquis de Pombal, the right-hand man of King Joseph I, went even further than the Spanish monarch. He curbed the Inquisition, subordinating it to the will of the crown and making all its actions dependent on his personal decision. These rulers did not rush in, destroying the Inquisition in one fell swoop. They acted gradually, step by step, extinguishing its ominous flame and sending the instruments of torture to gather dust in abandoned basements. But a real storm of indignation was stirred up by those who knew how to skillfully wield words. Voltaire, the French philosopher renowned for his sharp wit and scathing sarcasm, became the Inquisition's worst enemy. In his famous novella, Candide, he mocked the inquisitorial courts, vividly demonstrating their absurdity and nonsensical nature through the example of the Lisbon auto da fe. However, Voltaire's most resounding protest was his involvement in the case of Jean Calas, a Protestant executed in Toulouse on charges of murdering his own son, whom he allegedly wanted to forcibly convert to Catholicism. Voltaire devoted much time and energy to proving Calas's innocence. He succeeded in securing a posthumous rehabilitation, which became a true victory of reason over blind faith and religious fanaticism. Voltaire wrote angry letters, engaged in fierce disputes, and called the Inquisition a madness that had for centuries drowned Europe in blood and ignorance. His words spread throughout the continent, sowing doubt in people's minds and undermining confidence in church authority. But how did Voltaire manage to achieve such influence on public opinion? And why was his voice heard? Montesquieu, another prominent figure of the Enlightenment, in his book The Spirit of the Laws, demanded the creation of courts in which logic and justice reign, rather than superstition and prejudice. He sharply criticized power that rests on fear and violence, and his book became a true beacon for those who sought change and freedom. Diderot, with his famous encyclopedia, struck even deeper, collecting and systematizing knowledge that gradually displaced the old fears and prejudices that served as the support for the Inquisition. Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot became true enlighteners, illuminating the path to freedom and progress. Their ideas were picked up by students, rulers, and even priests who began to doubt the correctness of previous views. In Spain, Pablo de Olavide became a striking example of resistance to the Inquisition. This talented reformer dreamed of progress, eagerly read banned books, and boldly discussed freedom and justice. In 1776, the Inquisition seized him for these seditious views and imprisoned him in a monastery, but he did not break. 4 years later, he managed to escape to France, where he continued to write and fight for his ideals until his death at the beginning of the next century, remaining a symbol of those who sought to break the chains of the Inquisition. But what happened to Pablo de Olavide after his escape to France? And what was his fate? At the same time, in Portugal, the Marquis de Pombal not only restricted the power of the Inquisition, but also pulled out its teeth. He forbade it from acting without his consent, turning the formidable tribunal into an obedient shadow under the authority of the crown. And in Italy, Pope Benedict XIV, who occupied the papal throne from 1740, also went against old customs, softening the methods of the Inquisition and abolishing the most cruel forms of torture, making the courts less bloody and inhumane. These steps, taken within and outside the church, gradually deprived the Inquisition of its former power, leaving only faint echoes of its former horror. But the final blow to the Inquisition was dealt by Napoleon Bonaparte, who invaded Spain with an army and in 1808 closed the last inquisitorial tribunals. He looked upon the Inquisition as unnecessary junk that hindered the construction of a new Europe. His decrees disbanded the judges, and all papers and documents were sent to the archives. In Italy, Napoleon also left his mark, subjugating the church to his will and depriving it of its former political power. The French Revolution, which took place even before Napoleon's arrival, with its slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity, had already prepared the ground for the fall of the Inquisition, burning away the fear that had fueled its fire for centuries. In Germany, Frederick the Great, who ruled Prussia, despised superstition and fanaticism, building a state in which reason prevailed over belief in supernatural forces. His lands became a refuge for those fleeing persecution by the Inquisition. And in Austria, Emperor Joseph II banned witch trials, calling them a disgrace to an enlightened age. These rulers, each in their own way, sent the Inquisition into the past. The Enlightenment undermined belief in witchcraft and irrational fears that had once driven people to the stake. By the end of the 18th century, witch trials had become terrifying fairy tales told on long winter evenings by the fireplace. But how did the Inquisition manifest itself in the last years of its existence? Let us explore how its final chords sounded in Mexico, Spain, and Portugal, where even at its sunset it left noticeable traces of struggle, stubbornness, and irreconcilability. But was this a true victory? And what awaited those who continued to resist? The last echo of inquisitorial obscurantism sounded in Spain in 1826, becoming the final chord of a bygone era. In the small town of Valencia, a schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll was tried. He was a simple and modest man who taught children to read and write, but in his lessons he spoke more about reason and science than about God and religion. Neighbors began to whisper that he was an atheist who denied the church and its laws. The Inquisition, though weakened, was still breathing and ready to deliver a final blow. Cayetano Ripoll was seized and taken to the old inquisitorial hall, where the dust of centuries covered the stone walls. He stood firm and did not bow his head before his accusers, which aroused their anger and indignation. He was accused of atheism and blasphemy, which in those days sounded like a grim echo of a distant past. The sentence was harsh and merciless. Cayetano Ripoll was hanged in the town square before a silent crowd that witnessed the last execution committed by the Spanish Inquisition. King Ferdinand VII, who ruled Spain at that time, approved this cruel sentence, but the world was already changing rapidly. A few years later, in 1834, the Inquisition was officially abolished, and its sinister voice faded away forever. Cayetano Ripoll became the last whose life was cut short in its dark shadow, thereby marking the end of an era. But why was it Cayetano Ripoll who became the last victim of the Inquisition? And what did he do to deserve such a cruel punishment? In Portugal, the Inquisition also left a sinister mark, even after the death of its victims. In the 1750s, posthumous trials were held in Lisbon over people who had long been dead. One day, in a small Portuguese village, a woman who sewed clothes and raised children died. During her lifetime, no one touched her, but after her death in 1754, neighbors began to spread rumors about her strange behavior. They recalled that she sang unusual songs, did not attend church, and kept old books at home. Soon, her entire family fell under suspicion. The woman's son became a doctor, and her daughter married a Frenchman who read banned books. The Inquisition decided to punish them by desecrating their mother's memory. In 1756, her grave was opened, her remains were dug up and burned in the town square. It was a terrible ritual designed to shame the family and show that even death could not protect one from the judgment of the Inquisition. The crowd silently watched as the flames devoured the woman's remains, and her children stood aside, clenching their teeth and holding back tears. These tragic stories from Mexico, Spain, and Portugal vividly demonstrate the decline of the Inquisition. In Mexico, it judged for books that carried ideas of freedom and equality, but it could not break the spirit of those who read and distributed them. In Spain, the last execution was only a faint echo of a dark past, gradually fading into oblivion under the onslaught of new times. In Portugal, it persecuted even the dead, but it could not keep the living from striving for knowledge and freedom. The Age of Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, humanism, and justice, gradually eroded the very foundations of the Inquisition, stripping it of its power and influence. Those who fought against it became the architects of a new era, consigning the Inquisition to history forever. The Age of Reason supplanted the Age of Fire, and the Inquisition became nothing more than a dark chapter in the past, no longer capable of inspiring terror in people's hearts. But what lessons can be learned from the history of the Inquisition? And how can we avoid repeating such tragedies in the future? We thank you for spending time with us on this fascinating journey into the past, from the grim origins of the Inquisition to its inglorious end. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends, and come back for more historical discoveries. Until next time.